Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Dulwich and West Norwood for securing this important debate. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a rich irony that as we hold this debate to mark Windrush Day, another immigration scandal similar to that which affected the Windrush generation is potentially in the making. On Wednesday this week, the deadline for EU nationals to apply for settled status in the UK passed amidst worries that thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, had missed the deadline. So it's important for their sake, as well as for the sake of the wider Black, Asian and minority ethnic community, that we don't miss the opportunity of this debate to address the reasons why so many of the Windrush generation and their descendants were wrongly detained, deported and denied legal rights. And I think it's important to be clear what Wendy Williams identified in her Windrush Lessons Learned review, where she said, and I quote, "Whilst the Windrush scandal began to become public in late 2017, its roots lie much deeper. Successive rounds of legislation and policy effectively set traps for the Windrush generation. Over decades, legislation progressively eroded the rights of the Windrush generation. The hostile environment was another step on the long road towards a more restrictive immigration regime, but it was also a departure in terms of the scale and the seriousness of the effects which would be directly felt by individuals. The department, and by that, Mr Deputy Speaker, she means the Home Office developed immigration policy at speed, impelled by ministerial pressure, with too little consideration of the possible impact of the measures." And that's seen by the evidence which has monitored the impact of one of the key measures of the hostile environment, which is the right to rent scheme, one of the key measures that members of the Windrush generation came up against, because the evidence monitoring that scheme shows that it discriminates on the grounds of nationality and racial grounds. And many of the hostile environment policies operate by outsourcing immigration enforcement to people in the community, such as health workers, bank workers and employers. And in doing that, that process carries the same risk as has been identified with the right to rent scheme. Yet in the Windrush Lessons Learned report, Wendy Williams found that the Home Office didn't consider the risks to ethnic minorities appropriately as it developed the right to rent policy, and that it carried on with implementing the scheme after others had pointed out the risks and after evidence had arisen that the risks had materialised. And Wendy Williams has said that the right to rent policy exemplifies the Home Office's unwillingness to listen to other people's perspective or to take on board external scrutiny, and that stems from an absolute conviction rather than from evidence. And Mr Deputy Speaker, as a parliamentarian and a member of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, back in 2018, I was involved in this case study of two of the Windrush cases in some detail. And when we looked at the files of these people, we were able to see the way in which those acting on behalf of the Home Office had repeatedly ignored extensive documentary evidence that these people had every right to live in the United Kingdom. These people were detained and they were on the verge of being deported from the United Kingdom. So given that treatment, it's really perfectly understandable that there's serious concern about what might become of those EU nationals living in the United Kingdom who've not met the deadline for the resettlement scheme and therefore may find themselves without the sort of paperwork to evidence their right to be here that the Windrush generation or members of them found themselves without. And as always, it's going to be the most vulnerable who will suffer most during the Windrush scandal. It was old people who were hit hardest, and we've heard other honourable members talk about that already. And looking again to the EU settlement scheme, on Twitter last night, a consultant anaesthetist set out the story of his 83-year-old German-born mother who came to the United Kingdom in 1962. She's given a lifetime of dedicated service to the United Kingdom. And now, sadly, like so many people of her generation, she has dementia. She's no understanding of the process to gain the settled status. And without her son's assistance, she wouldn't have been able to do so. What of the elderly and vulnerable people with no loving family to help them navigate our complicated immigration system? They will be at risk of losing bank accounts, tenancies, access to the NHS and welfare benefits, just as the Windrush generation did. So we need to use this debate today to make sure that we do learn lessons from what happened during the Windrush scandal. Its effects were felt far and wide. One of my constituents, a man in his 70s, returned from holiday a few years ago to be told by border force officials that he was an illegal immigrant. He'd been born in Canada to a Scottish mother and had come to the United Kingdom as a baby and known nowhere else. And he never thought he would be the kind of person who would be caught up in the Windrush scandal. But he was, and he was extremely upset and had a genuine fear that he was going to be deported until my office were able to work to sort out his status and his paperwork. And another constituent of mine, a British national from the Commonwealth who came here before 1988, has been unable to get work as a professional bus driver for the last few years because he was wrongly accused of hijacking someone else's identity. And although his Department of Work and Pensions file was eventually cleared and his right to benefits reinstated, the Home Office didn't regularise his identity. He can't get a new passport and he can't get a driving licence. He came to see me, desperate to get his driving licence so that he could work and unaware of the Windrush scheme remedy. My office are now working with him to complete a Windrush application. And I hope the Minister's listening and will ask his officials to look at this case specifically to learn lessons of the devastation which can be caused by failing to properly resolve these types of situation. As has already been indicated, responses to parliamentary questions show that the Windrush compensation scheme is a lengthy experience for some at least. Many have been waiting for over a year, and as has already been said shamefully, 21 people have died waiting for a response. So it's time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the scheme was properly resourced and that legal aid was made available to help claimants through the bureaucracy. So my other ask for the Minister today is whether he can give us an undertaking to properly resource this compensation scheme on which the Home Office has to date really drastically underspent its budget, and also to afford legal aid for the more complicated cases. But above and beyond everything else, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what we should take from today's debate is, as Wendy Williams' report was called, the lessons which should be learned from the Windrush scandal. And we should take them forward to make sure that no other people living in the United Kingdom suffer that sort of treatment in the future. If we don't address the hostile environment, if we don't address its implications through the right to rent scheme, in the workplace, in the health service, in the benefits system, then we're at risk of going back to the days of signs in the window saying no blacks, no Irish need apply, except the signs won't be there because the system is more insidious and more covert, but it's still there. The Windrush scandal should have marked the end of the hostile environment, but the Home Office is forging ahead with it regardless. And their approach was recently typified by the carrying out of an immigration raid during a religious festival on Glasgow's south side. And the local multicultural community there firmly and peaceably showed what they thought of the British government's conduct, and the victims of the raid were released. And the shameful, heavy-handed approach to immigration typified by the Windrush scandal really should have no place in the modern United Kingdom. It certainly has no mandate in Scotland and no place in modern Scotland. And that's one of the many reasons why the SNP wins election after election in Scotland, and the responsibility to realise the means to do something about the hostile environment in Scotland weighs very heavily on my party. But ultimately, the responsibility for it weighs on the Minister's party. And I want to hear from the Minister today that he has learned the lessons of the Windrush scandal and that steps will be taken to avoid it ever happening again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Video link. Bill Rubiro Hadi.